Good morning, everyone. My name's Alex Fernando. I'm really pleased to represent DECRA today in hosting this webinar and very much appreciate the support of the Australian Institute of Health and Safety in doing so. I'd also like to welcome all of you on the call and appreciate this webinar is in response to a huge amount of interest off the back of a recent webinar on the 7 brain hazards, which was run a few months ago. Webinars, as you all can appreciate, are run as good as the interaction and dialogue that we can encourage. And so I really ask that you make use of the platform. There is some facilities to enable you to ask questions and contribute to the discussion. And you can also feel free to email us any questions that you'd like to explore down the track. Before we jump into this, for those of you who are unfamiliar with DECRA, our parent organisation as purpose is to keep people safe at work, on the road and at home, and we've done this for over 90 years through the good work of over 45,000 colleagues across the world. Our consulting arm, which is quite a subset of the overall organisation, is very much specialised in leadership and culture transformation. We focus on serious injury and fatality reduction, the design of safety programs that enable better decisions throughout the organisation and ultimately enable people to be more productive and engaged in the work they do. The folk around the table here today obviously all have a very deep desire to make a positive difference in safety outcomes for people and the organisations in which we work. For those of you who don't know me, and I can see a few familiar names in the audience, hello to everyone, and great to see people joining from right across the country. I think at the moment we have over 300 registered, and there's a good well over 100 people who are on the call right now. My role within DECRA is as Executive GM for our consulting arm within Oceania and South Africa. I've got a varied background across several high-risk industries, including oil and gas, petrochemical, manufacturing, and what I really enjoy is working with organisations to develop strategies and initiatives that enhance decision-making, assurance, and ultimately reduce exposure to people. I'm also very pleased to introduce you to Joe Doyle. Joe is one of our principal consultants, and I've really enjoyed working with Joe over recent times and getting a real deeper insight into what makes organisations tick from a leadership and culture perspective, and also very enlightened to better understand how we as people within organisations cannot ignore the role of our own neuroscience that contributes to our risk alignment and decision-making within organisations. Joe, are you there?
I certainly am. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for taking the time to join us today, and I look forward to an interesting discussion.
Excellent. So what we've got planned for the next 45 minutes or so is broadly around exploring the types of risks that are present when it comes to decision-making in workplaces, and explore that through the lens of how we make risk-based decisions, what factors go into those, and then finally we'll spend some time talking about aligning on risks throughout the business. These are the main headlines, but of course, very much interested in the questions that you may have around this, and we'll hopefully extend that into around 10 to 15 minutes of conversation. So before we kick off, what we thought we might do is pose a question to you, and through the way of a poll. So what you should be seeing on your screen right now is a poll question. And really, this is designed to just trigger off a few thoughts around what you may be experiencing in your workplace or the workplaces that you've experienced in the past. So assuming that you can all see the poll on the screen, the question that I'm posing to you is, how many of you experienced the following in your facility? A push to meet production targets over safety targets, continue to run operations despite actions against procedure, inadequate supervision due to staffing reductions, and finally deteriorating equipment or facilities due to a lack of funding. So it looks like the horse race is off. We're seeing an incredible focus on inadequate supervision due to staffing reductions. So that might be a sign of the times. I'll just show the results as we're speaking. So what you should see on the screen now is a live polling result across the well over 140 people contributing to that response. So by and large, it looks like the majority of folk on the call feel that there is inadequate supervision due to staffing reduction. Second to that, there's a push to meet production targets over safety targets. And looks like we've also got a perspective that there's deteriorating equipment or facilities due to a lack of funding. I might close the poll there. So I think what we're seeing here is probably a combination of a number of different things. It's certainly something that I've experienced through the various organisations that I've been exposed to, either working within or being exposed to some of the consulting work that I've done. One of the things that is important to recognise is that nobody's alone in this game, and I don't think there's, what does good look like is obviously different to different people and different organisations. I don't think it means that we're bad people or we make bad decisions, but certainly interested in understanding, Joe, your perspective on the results here, and also, what does operational risk look like, and how does that play into the types of perspectives that people are sharing with us on the call?
And very interesting, Alex. I saw that we had a comment saying that all three of the four actually were relevant to one of our participants. So this takes us into really understanding the difference between what we normally talk about in regards to safety and operational risk. What comes to mind when we talk about safety is generally, or risk is generally health, safety and environmental risk that we see on the left-hand side there. We'll certainly talk about that here today, but we'll also talk about a more broader context than that. And so we'll talk about operational risk that encompasses what we normally talk about in the safety world in terms of harm to people and the environment. But then we'll also extend that a little bit further by looking at what could cause disruption within businesses. So this could encompass anything like upsets in the making, along with other evidence that we are at risk for not getting things right the first time. And you'll also see in that second bullet point there on the bottom right that when we look at the entire business and we think of the workforce that you're a part of, all those people actually out there executing the work, think about those times when decisions need to be taken by those individuals or teams. And maybe there's some things that are actually in conflict, as we saw from the poll that, deteriorating equipment or not enough supervision actually contributes to those decision-making pieces as well. So I could be someone on the operational floor and I'm thinking about my personal safety versus actually getting an order out to a customer, and that's what's being pushed down by the supervisory levels, etc. Or maybe there's an issue around quality as well. So when people actually have to make that decision, we need to consider all of the underlying factors that contribute to that decision making. We also need to understand the neuroscience behind decision making, which we'll also talk about today, that yield high quality decisions, because that's ultimately what we want for all of our people out there doing the work for us and for us out there doing the work as well. We just wanted to really differentiate between those two terms, HSE risk, so the standard safety risk, and operational risk, which we'll be talking about from a more broader brush today. As we move through, we'll see on this next slide, and I'm not sure whether how many of you have actually heard of this particular incident from Formosa in the US. There was a plastics vinyl chloride monomer explosion in 2004, which occurred at around 10:30 at night when this explosion happened. As you would expect, a lot of things actually kicked into this particular incident before it blew up the facility with a devastating outcome of 5 people losing their lives and 3 people being seriously injured from this particular incident. Certainly, there was a lot of decisions that were made that led up to this. And what we really want to point out here is that it's not about the bad apples in the workforce, which, you know, in times gone past, that was certainly a way that we used to look at things. But from this perspective, a few people at different times leading up to the event made some poor decisions along the way. Our focus is really on how did those decisions come to result in a situation like this. Decisions made at different levels of the organisation. And that's how we're going to frame our discussion today. When we look at how does operational risk and the decisions associated with that get made, how do leaders play a role in that, and how do we end up with a situation where there is a large fire based on an employee opening up a valve and allowing a live reactor to release chemicals that causes a catastrophe. It's pretty easy to focus on that employee, but we would suggest that there's a whole lot of other things going on that we would want to have a look at as well. So Alex, I'll hand back over to you for the next poll.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think it's a good segue into just exploring a bit further that notion of, you know, if it's not the employee, and obviously good people, you know, well-intended folk don't make decisions, you know, that lead to catastrophic failure in a way that's happened in the case that you described there, Joe. And I think there's obviously broader organisational system issues that contribute to those decisions. So I think it'd be good to get a sense from the folk on the call as to, you know, what do you actually think contributes to people making the wrong decision, and that is a fairly loaded question in that sense. And so I think it'd be just useful just to trigger off a bit more exploration of this topic by posing that question to you. And what I'm going to do is open up another poll, which you should see on this screen right now. And so the question is, you know, why do you think people sometimes make the wrong decision? They don't have all the facts or understand the consequences. They think meeting demands is more important than safety. They see others working in a similar way, so it must be okay. They think the risks are acceptable. They want to complete job tasks quickly and move on. So very interesting so far. We've got the first horse bolting away. They don't have all the facts or understand the consequences. So I'll keep that poll open for another 30 seconds or so, just to elicit a few more responses.
It's interesting to see that they don't understand all the facts, and when with the last poll we saw the lack of supervision was one of the issues as well. So communication obviously being a key issue here.
My observation here, Joe, is that you know, whilst each of these responses, you know, offer a certain perspective, I suspect there's multiple layers that contribute to these outcomes where, you know really well-intended folk make a decision, but you know, I think to our earlier point that, you know, the issues that contribute to this are far broader at both an individual, team and organisational decision-making perspective. So I'd love us to just explore what that looks like, Joe, and perhaps just lend your thinking to what we're seeing here.
Absolutely. And I think what's really encouraging out of the poll as well is seeing the maturity of the people in the audience and maturity of the organisations in the audience with really putting safety beyond production demands, even though that increased a little bit just then, but that's really encouraging to see. So if we can actually then have a look at this idea about people making wrong decisions or bad decisions. But before we talk about, how do we stop people from doing that, let's look at some labels often used during incident investigations to draw conclusions about people's behaviour. These terms and concepts are used because people hold an unexamined belief that so-called human errors stem from one or more of the three, what we call the three I's. The first one being ignorance, second being ineptitude, and third being ineptitude or incompetence, and third being indifference. What we know about this is we apportion blame if we use these labels to employees when errors occur. This traditional mental model about human error hasn't really served us that well. And we mentioned it before, but it has really led to the bad apples thinking, where people get disciplined or even fired when a serious error occurs. Having practiced this approach for many decades without reducing error rates significantly, and I know that we have started to shift our thinking over the last few years around this, we need to shift to our traditional mindset about human error. And to help us make that shift, let's think about what we call the modern I, or the errors of inconsistency. These inconsistency errors are made by employees who know what they need to know, so therefore they're not ignorant. They have demonstrated ability to do a task, so they're not inept, they have capability, and they actually care about doing their work well. So they're not indifferent in regards to their task work, yet they still make errors. Now, what I wanted, the caveat here is obviously when people make intentional errors. So we're really talking about unintentional errors here. So in fact, the most frequent perpetrators of inconsistency errors are actually experienced employees, not new hires. And the more complex the systems in which humans operate, the higher the risk there is for such performance inconsistency. Faced with this reality, and given the increasing complexity and dynamism of our operational systems, we clearly need a new approach to human errors and error mitigation. So let's have a look at some factors, some of these risk factors, with three in particular that we're going to bucket things under, for want of a better description, for the purpose of our conversation. As we've just discussed, individual factors certainly can come into risk-based decision making. As an example, do we actually even notice or perceive that the risk is there? Or did we not catch it for whatever given reason? Also, did we individually think that that particular risk was worth taking based on our past experience? Some people on our poll today mentioned, well, I see other people making those choices, and so it seems all right to me. So individuals definitely have a role to play here. We will talk about how we can help that particular factor be even stronger as we work through this to get better quality decisions being made. We'll also look at work team factors. So when you get groups of people together working, which we find in most factories and operations around the country, the question to ask is, what behaviours do we see going on within that work team? Are those behaviours helpful or hindering to each other? Or what's the group's perception on what's considered risky versus safe? what's how we do things around here look like? All these questions are really important because people do often alter the way that they conduct work when they're in groups versus individually. So interesting, we'll talk about that today as well. And then we'll end our conversation around organisational factors. So how does the organisation contribute to risk-based decision making? What tone does the organisation, and so hence we're talking about, do the leaders set for people actually executing the work? And that can be whether that's in a meeting or whether it's on the tools. And how are risk-based decisions rewarded within the organisation? We believe that these are the three buckets that if you invest in really well as a business, if you understand your gaps and do what you can to mitigate those gaps associated with these three buckets, you'll get greater reliability, in particular around risk-based decision making. And so I would anticipate that most people on the call today have experienced situations where you're working in operations, there's an incident and you start investigating, and there's a number of things that come into play with individual decision making, I should say. So this may play out where people are working and they have an internally perceived pressure or external pressure placed on them to get the work done. And it almost seems as if they just turn the risk-based decision-making switch off. An example of this may be an operator on a production line reaches in through an equipment to make a quick adjustment to the equipment while the machine is still moving. And if you actually have a conversation with this individual and inquire about the reason why for doing so, their reasoning could be, well, it takes too long to shut it down. And if I actually apply the right procedure to shut it down, it takes time to get it back up and running again, and it's more likely that people further down the line will get on my back, or a leader will get on my back and apply pressure to get it moving. I've actually seen this play out in an operation. So therefore, there are all sorts of decisions that come into our decision making around risk taking. So that whether it's peer pressure, a desire to get along with others, which we'll talk about a little later, or just get the work done. We have to ask ourselves, why do we do it? So for all the training and all the discussion and all the focus on safety, how can people still be seriously injured and unfortunately even killed at work, that are very seasoned and very knowledgeable and skilled employees? So how can this still happen? And so it's not the lack of giving a huge investment in terms of trying to get a great result in terms of decision quality and making safe work execution as planned, but we still see that there are gaps in place. So Alex, we'll try again another poll and I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, look, you've really triggered off a few thoughts, Joe, and it's in fact raised a couple of questions from the audience. I think that there's probably a broad range of reasons that contribute to why we manage risk at an individual level differently. We've got different perceptions, and I think as Dean on the call says, the audience has asked, perhaps some of the individual factors sit in the unknown unknowns, or perhaps it's perception-based. But look, I think let's open up the poll to the audience and answer this question here, which I find quite intriguing even at a personal level. And the question is, how many of you have ever driven over the posted speed limit, and if so, by how much? Now, I do know a few of you had difficulty with responding to the poll, so it should be open now, and what I will do is just keep it open for a bit longer. I believe what I did was I prematurely closed the poll, so it would have limited the number of responses. So I'll keep it open for about 30 seconds. I love the open transparency with folk, given revealing the fact that they exceed the speed limit by up to 50 kilometres an hour. Just put out a group email and let us know that you're on the road. I think typically it's looking like 5 to 10 kilometres an hour over the speed limit, Joe, so far. But let's see, we've still got a lot more responses flooding in right now. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and post the results now. So, Joe, as probably what I was expecting was somewhere in that order of 5 to 10 kilometres. So it's very interesting that there is a bit of a bell-shaped curve here where there's a proportion of the audience who never go over the speed limit, which is fantastic. But then, of course, those of us who are perhaps, take a bit of appropriate risk depending on the situation, do tend to spend 5 to 10 kilometres, maybe even 15 kilometres over the speed limit, which is very interesting. And in my mind, it probably tells us a couple of things. Having procedures, policies, rules, and laws aren't enough to shape the behaviour of folk, and of course we've all got a different risk appetite in my mind. I tend to, I would say, depending on the situation, 5 kilometres, 10 kilometres over the speed limit, and then of course, having all sorts of alarms and checks to nudge me back into the right zone is always very important. Always welcome the backseat driver that says to me, "Hey, the speed limit is X and you're at Y, so you need to be mindful." What are your thoughts, Joe? What do we need to do to sort of make this more relevant in a workplace situation? And obviously, how does that inform decision making? Would be a great way of segueing into the next part of the discussion.
Thanks, Alex. So really, as you've mentioned, risk-taking really is in our genes, and we are hardwired for risk aversion as well. So there are 3 factors in neuroscience that we can point to immediately to really understand how this risk-taking plays out for us. The first is, when we feel protected, we are generally more adventurous. So that mindset, okay, I'm all good, nothing can happen to me because I'm wearing all the right gear, all the right PPE, I'm following all the rules, so I feel protected, so I may or may not take an extra or push the boundaries a little bit because I feel protected because of those things. Secondly, we're hardwired for optimism and confidence. So there's actually a little place in our brain which houses the optimism bias center called the IFG, or the inferior frontal gyrus. And that part of our brain actually fires up when we are approaching a situation that involves a risky decision. When we take that risk and nothing bad happens, we become more confident and we actually get used to that feeling, and the neurons in the brain that were firing at the time become further hardwired for optimism and confidence associated. Sooner or later, there's a possibility that we'll actually trip up, but as long as we don't, we're going to continue to take that risk and possibly also increase our risk appetite. The last is that we are pleasure people and reward risks are repeated. If I'm working to make a deadline and I take a little shortcut, for example, and my boss sees it and he or she doesn't say anything, that's a reward. And especially if the boss says, "Hey, nice job, you got that product out," so you can bet that my little reward center in the brain actually lights up and therefore is reinforced as well. So, all those who are online or in the workforce watching that particular exchange take place and see what happens when that risk is rewarded without any negative consequence actually taking place, it's also a reinforcement for them as well. So when we're looking at risk or exposure changing around us, increasing our vulnerability to being hurt, the thalamus in the brain is analysing risk and it sends up a red flag. As I suggested just then, if we have repeated exposure over time with no consequence, these red flags begin to diminish. And through that process, we become desensitised to the risk, so to speak. So right away, we can see the implications here, particularly for those operations that have jobs or roles that require high routine and repetition, where we also know people are more likely to fall into a non-thinking state of decision-making, or what is commonly called autopilot, or in our language here at DACRA, fast brain mode. So as a leader, we can counter this desensitisation through messaging to our employees, reminding them, but also engaging them. Because when we engage someone in conversation, we're actually getting them out of that fast brain mode into what we call slave brain or conscious thinking mode. So we can have that discussion around the right way to approach change and exposure and all the potential consequences of perhaps the less than perfect way to do things, which then relates back to our polling in regards to why people on the line thought people made wrong decisions because they didn't have either enough information or weren't aware of the consequences associated with that. Probably one thing we haven't talked about as yet as well is in regards to we've talked about risk aversion, but we also we've got 165 or so people on the line here. We all have different appetite to risk. So some of us are very cautious individuals. We actually move away from risk. So our decision making will be based around that. And then along the continuum of that, on the other end of the spectrum, we have people who actually move towards risk. So they're your adventure seekers of the world. So if any of you on the line have actually jumped out of a plane, I would say that you are one of those moving towards risk individuals. So that also is playing out here as we think about the key challenges associated with the brain and risk processing. So again, when we talk about systems, it's not just the brain, it's also around how we're genetically and how our personality is wired as well.
And Jo, you triggered off a few questions from the audience, maybe just picking out one of those from Graham, and I appreciate the questions coming through, everyone. What about complacency and being too familiar with the job, doing jobs without thinking? What are your thoughts around that, Jo?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we kind of bucket complacency into I don't care, but it's also complacency can be due to I'm in a high routine and repetitious role. So what we know about the brain is when we're in those type of roles, and particularly when we're very familiar with something, we know that the brain actually slips into what we call fast brain mode. And we know that, up to 45 to 50% of our day, we're actually in that non-thinking or fast brain mode. So we need to be really mindful about labeling people as complacent rather than thinking about how the brain actually works and how it switches in and conserves energy. I'm not suggesting that there aren't complacent people out there, but certainly it goes back to those three and four eyes, the modern eye. There's three. Most people, if you think about it, most people come to work and they want to do a good job. They know their job. They're skilled to do their job, and they actually care about their own personal safety and the safety of those around them. And ultimately, everyone wants to go home at the end of it, right, each day. So I think we just need to be mindful around the conversation. So this leads us also into further key challenges around how the brain processes risk. So the other things that we need to consider is that risk-taking is actually contagious. So from a work team perspective, if I see someone else taking a risk and nothing happens to them, then my aversion to doing the same thing is actually going to diminish. So this risk over time is actually going to become acceptable to me, and then what happens is I will become more contagious when others see me repeat that same behaviour. So one of the things that leaders really need to do in the workplace is to make sure that if they see someone taking a risk, whether they get injured or not, we don't reward them for doing that. And that reward could be as simple as walking past without saying anything, so an unintentional reward. Usually the control should have some sort of simple, quick conversation if it is just a walk past. But if you don't do this, other employees will see it and the contagion will grow and it will spread throughout your workforce. Therefore, the messaging around these concepts is really important. A lot of us can probably get better about how we message one-on-one in conversations, particularly if we think about what behaviour we're trying to drive within our teams as we influence through every conversation, as we influence through our email communications and any other form of communications that we engage in. So what's the focus? What's the focus of your communication? Is it mostly on what I don't want you to do and what's not okay around here? Or are we covering that, which is great, and our intentional focus in our communication is on here's how we do things around here, and here's what I expect of everyone around here, and then that becomes the drumbeat for individuals to get behind. So let's challenge each other, have a look at how the messages that are being sent are actually being received outbound from you as an individual. But also, what do you see in your organisation in that regard, that if there's any improvement that can be made there to focus on what you want, not just what you don't want. We would also want to get into something like, around here, we're people that value getting back to our families. And most of the organisations that I work with these days, that is front and centre in what they talk about. So there's always a strong why behind we do certain things, and making that link back to the culture that you actually want to create. And here we do things at the right time for that why reason, because there's a lot at stake in it. So that's a much stronger message than walking past someone and saying, hey, you should stop doing that. So to add to the individual factors that we've talked through already, we'll also have a quick look at fatigue. So cognitive fatigue is really about the brain shutting down because we've not had enough high quality sleep to recharge our batteries, so to speak. And what we see is when we don't have that high quality sleep, our decision making is impaired. So no matter what great businesses put in place for us to help us make safe decisions, cognitively fatigued people make decisions, it can be compared to being drunk. So this means that if we're impaired, if we've not slept to the point where we're actually experiencing cognitive fatigue, which is different to, what I feel a bit tired today, you'll see on the slide there that some of the things that go off kilter when we haven't had this sleep over the last 27 or 24 hours or 7 days cumulatively, we really can't notice that we're impacted by fatigue. So we're actually, if we're the one fatigued, we're not the best judge. In a way, it's like when you ask someone who's had too much to drink, are you okay to drive? Most times these people will say, yeah, of course I am. And they don't really realise that they're not. The same principle here. So when leaders ask, are you all right to stay on a few extra hours? Most fatigued people are actually will tend to say yes. So it's much better to actually assess people, have a clear assessment process in place to gauge whether people are fatigued rather than just doing the guesstimate and asking, are you okay? So what do we actually do about this? Given what we know when we want to keep our brain in an optimal condition, one of the first things we want to do is make sure individuals have capabilities to combat what we call brain-centered hazards, which you've heard us talk about previously before, potentially. This is really a group of factors or internal hazards created by the functioning of the brain that contribute to human error that we call brain-centered hazards. So teaching people about these capabilities is really important. Essentially, teaching people how their brain operates while at work, and obviously can be applied to life in general, but certainly for the context of today, we talk about things like fatigue, divided attention, vision-centered hazards, and so on, and how these things impact safe decision making. If we give people this understanding about their own internal hardware and how it operates, we can also give them tools to take better control of that. We'll also look as well at leaders. For those on the call here today, leaders also need to understand about how the brain operates and be able to speak about how this impacts risky decision making. We will also talk in a second how group thinking impacts risky decision making. As a group of leaders, it's good when leadership teams are sparking those conversations around risk versus safe decisions, which really keeps it conscious and in front of mind for people. Because if we don't do that, that's when it will especially fade into the background, as the last point here illustrates. What we know about the human brain is that it loves to take things off the care about list, as it takes a lot of energy to care about certain things. So, you know, your money, your relationships, your safety, getting the work done, and so on. As soon as the brain realises it's getting pretty good at getting good results and not really caring about certain things, so with regards to safety, maybe not following a particular standard operating procedure by skipping a step, as long as it knows that things worked out fine, as we've talked about previously, actually, and in fact, I got recognition from my boss because I did that, and potentially we become desensitized. So it's not that people are lazy, but our brains love to take things off that list of things to care about, because that's how our brains actually conserve energy. So if we don't do anything about it, safety comes off the list slowly but surely, and we don't even see it coming off. So it's important to keep focused, consciously focused and intentionally focused, so we don't get desensitized to that change. So it's not all on the individual by any stretch, but this is one of the factors, and we want to make sure people understand that the hardware, the brain's hardware, and how they can drive their bus, so to speak, so that they can actually get better results in regards to what they do. So we'll talk briefly about the work team as well, given that we've covered off on the individual factors. And let's talk through what that looks like, because work team factors, particularly in an operational environment, is a big factor that contributes to risk-taking decisions for teams. So from a neuroscience perspective, this is all about, not all about, but a big part of this is about the social brain. I think we can generally agree that two brains are better than one. More heads are better than one, and that's generally the case. But let's talk about that when it's not the case, where we can get it wrong because there is more than one person in play. This is where the social brain comes into risk-based decision making. So in the brain, the social brain is that the band that runs just between your ears, but on the outer surface across the very top of your brain, just underneath the skull. Your social brain is really important to your survival, and it's one reason why the human race has been around for so long. It's responsible for making sure that we get on well with people, that we're, occasionally checking in to see how we're going with a group. And historically, over many, many years, those that stay with the group, stay with the herd, so to speak, tend to do better than the ones that don't. So this is part of our internal hardware. It's pretty old school, evolutionary, but it's still alive and well today. So a goal of the brain is for us to get along with people, and there's no secret there. But think of it, when we're at work and we see others working in a way that's really not the way that's been defined for us to work, it's not as safe as it's meant to be, so risk is elevating, and you notice that starting to happen. So it's really important for people, for everyone to know that we are actually hardwired, our brain is hardwired not to speak up and say anything about that. And so let's think about that for a moment. So for all of the messaging that goes out, all the workforces around the world about approaching others and we should speak up, and if you see something, you should say something, that's certainly all true. But we also have to be honest about how we operate and how the brain operates. And you'll actually feel a tendency inside not to do that. So you may have a voice whispering in your head, yeah, but if I say something here, that may upset my relationship with so-and-so, or people won't like it if I speak up. So if we're really honest about that with people when we're giving the first message about approaching others, speaking up, that's all great, and that's what we want around here. We're likely to get a better result if we say, you feel like maybe you shouldn't speak up. So let's talk about it honestly. It's also very interesting that when looking at the social brain, it perceives threats to your social interactions and your social relationships the same way as it would perceive threats of physical pain. So if we were to put you, a volunteer on the lines, if we were to put you into a functional MRI scan, and if you would let us and we had a look at your brain and you let us insult you a little bit or maybe say some things that you didn't like, your brain would actually light up in the same way as if you were being physically assaulted. So that's how deep the need is for us to get along with people. So for example, if I'm sitting at a meeting table and somebody overrides something I've said there in a public setting and says, so I've actually brought up an issue around a safety issue, and someone says, you know what, it's safe enough, so let's move on, my brain will actually light up in the same way as an animal is about to jump and attack me. So that's what we're fighting against here from a neuroscience perspective. So when we come to our work team factors, we need to put things in place to fight against this, or we won't get the results that we need to get along the way. So this then brings us to what we call groupthink. A mentor of mine, and some of you may have heard David Musgrave on the previous conference call. I call him my mentor and my guru. He tells a story where he was working with a business and noticed when invited to one of their meetings that all of the most senior people had a seat at the table. And the people that were less senior in rank and tenure were standing around the edges and didn't have a seated seat. He thought that this was pretty interesting because what he saw in the way of how that meeting functioned is that there wasn't a whole lot of people disagreeing or offering counter arguments to things that were being discussed by the people sitting at the table. So there was a whole bunch of people flanking the walls, not really saying a whole lot. When he called this out, that the group could be susceptible to groupthink, everyone would agree with what was being said because of the tenure of the people sitting at the table. They actually had no idea about that and really didn't even notice that people weren't contributing for those that were standing. And it was just, from their perspective, it was just how they ran their meetings. So this is all about how we can inoculate against these situations. If you've a meeting where you need to have a discussion or input or robust debate, and where certain people might not speak up or might not contribute or might not offer new thoughts, we want to prompt for these things so that we get a better participation in meetings and in deeper discussions going. A little bit, encourage that black hat thinking as well. So what's really important to understand is if you don't prompt for it and the brain experiences groupthink, that is, it goes along and it gets along, and if we don't speak out, again, it will actually rewire itself with regards to how we interact with the people around us, and we'll become less and less likely to speak up and offer a counter-argument or maybe a safer argument. So if we don't catch it, we're actually setting ourselves up for failure here. And in terms of our work team factor, we want to watch out for that in particular. One of the things that we can do to combat that is really making sure that people have a questioning attitude. But also beyond attitudes, it's really looking at collaborative questioning, encouraging and asking really pivotal questions, really well-placed questions to get people thinking in new ways and about new ways of doing things that may be better or safer. And if that's not occurring in your pre-start job brief or your boardroom meetings, wherever you've got people coming together to discuss things, it's fair to ask, why isn't it? Why is that not occurring? So and the thing is, if we don't actually put prompts in place for this, we're actually creating the risk for groupthink to run wild. So when it comes to collaborative questioning, because it is a systemic part of the team discussion, that's when you get real results. And if we just leave these kind of great moments of great communication as just that, as moments that are optional but not really systemic, what we really want to do is make them a regular part of how we do things. So making sure that we're asking the right questions when we pull the team together, and focusing on operational risk in a way that we said we would. We also want to understand how groups are at risk of deteriorating in communication. So, imagine that we're under the pump, we're all busy today, more than usual. Imagine that in today's world. So we should realise that in those times, in our discussions, in our meetings we are about to have, it's likely that our communication will erode because the pressure kicks in to get things done and push forward. So it's really important that we actually call that out as a team. Be explicit that we've got plenty of time to have our discussion, even though we feel that there's pressure associated with it. So we've got time to do the work in the right time, in the right way, in the safe way, and let's make time to do that. So we want to be really candid as well about asking, how's the team going? How are we working together now? Is everybody participating in the discussion, or just some people? Is there tension? Is there not? Teams change over time, and how these communications manifest themselves, that also changes as well. So you want to make it a conscious discussion rather than just an unconscious process that is happening. So make sure you bring it up. And another thing that we can do is 3-part communication, particularly for critical tasks, which is really important. We really want to make sure that we're talking back and forth through the steps of that critical task to make sure that we're all on the same page along the way. But often what we see, particularly when we're working with people that we know really well, we feel, and as we've talked about, we're hardwired to feel this way. We feel that we don't need to communicate because, you know what, Jack and Jill, we work together a lot. I know what you're going to say, you know what I'm going to say, and we all get on well. So let's not say anything. You know, we've read many injury reports where this has actually happened. There's been no communication. Someone doesn't say something to the other, particularly if they weren't expecting it, and now somebody has got an injury to deal with. So we want to watch for that. And in some regards, a three-part communication with our best friends at work or the people that we work with every day is vital. So we need to make sure that we have that in place. Never assume we're all on the same page. The last point here is very important. We've saved the last one for a reason. We want to make sure that in work teams, subject matter experts are actually informing effective decision making. Often authority figures are the ones that make decisions, and that's great, and they sometimes are, but we also want to make sure that the people doing the work are informing decision making. I realise we're certainly very close to the hour, so we'll work through the organisational factors now. And part of this is talking about that team, individual contribute to decision making. But we also know, going back to the Formosa example, many things happened here from an organisational perspective. Before the incident happened, decisions were made to reduce staffing, remove supervisors, and also this type of incident had occurred before at other facilities. Safety solutions had been implemented there at one of them, but it was decided not to extend those solutions to other sites. So by the time they actually got to round two, this particular Formosa site, a couple of weeks out before the explosion, it ended up being too late. So all of these team, individual and organisational factors contribute. In terms of creating a risk profile for a company, there is risk perception that exists within it. So how I perceive risk is different from how Jack does and from how Jill does. What I may consider to be at risk, they may not. And organisations are the same way. Your company needs to define operational risk so everyone has a clear understanding, and then they need to define how much the organisation needs to define how much they're going to accept to meet business goals, because it's a balance, and in an ideal world we'd be good at everything. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, and if a company doesn't define the operational risk it's willing to accept, its risk appetite, its risk tolerance, your employees are going to define it for you, and everyone in the company is going to define it differently. So if we start aligning the risk at the top, get the leadership to agree and define what is acceptable risk, that is, what level of risk are we as a leadership team willing to accept, willing to tolerate, willing to place our employees at a level of acceptable risk to meet business needs and demands. You then cascade that decision down into the organisation, which will formalise what risks you are going to face and how you're going to prioritise them. And this will then become the framework of how it will guide everyone within the organisation in regards to risk-based decision making. So to just close off, as you see on the screen as we talk through the summary here, the ultimate impact of these choices is often, there's too many examples where really well-known businesses and often really reputable businesses know a lot about risk and a lot about safety, but have got it wrong. So this isn't about it happening to other people or other businesses. This is about the best of the best and the brightest still getting it wrong sometimes. So we come back to those individual, team and organisational factors, and it really warrants investigation into how we're going, how are we equipped to make right first-time decisions each and every time when it comes to our critical tasks. Or are we a bit weak in any of these areas along the way? That's the real message that we want to bring today. Also, it doesn't have to involve injury. It's to do with quality, it's to do with reputation and brand protection. It's all under the banner of operational reliability. Did we do the things the way that we said we were going to do them? It could be safety, but it's also broader than that. And if there's a weakness, let's fix it now before so many people are impacted, because it's really not worth it. So, Alex, I'll just hand back over to you.
Yeah, sure. Look, Joe, I really appreciate the very thought-provoking perspective that you shared with us. It's prompted a whole bunch of questions, and I'm trying to work out which ones would be the most impactful. Clearly, you've triggered off some thoughts around our predisposition from a neuroscience perspective in terms of how the brain works, and then how that can manifest itself at both an individual, team, and leadership or organisational level. Maybe a question that I can pull out from the audience here. How does one appropriately balance the focus on human error versus the organisational system and its need to create a system that allows folk to achieve good outcomes? It'd be great to hear your thoughts and perspectives on that, Joe.
So, sorry, Alex, can you just repeat that question, please?
Yeah, so it's how do we the notion of the behaviours of the individual and human error. How do we balance that at the individual level versus what does the organisational system, contribute to or allow or enable individuals to continue to achieve good outcomes? So I think it's really around how do you balance the fact that it's not about behaviours versus the neuroscience in our brain, and then balance that in terms of what the organisational leaders can actually do differently.
Hopefully what we've talked through today actually shows that it's really important to take a systems approach, that none of these are mutually exclusive. Obviously doing things like an organisational assessment certainly helps us identify gaps from an individual team or an organisational or even leadership level, but certainly it's understanding that understanding these concepts around decision making, and if we don't have a clear definition, if we aren't all aligned, if there's misalignment that sits within functions or pockets of the business, that's going to create a greater risk profile for the business.
Yeah, it's a fairly big question, isn't it, Joe?
It's a big question.
There's another couple of great questions here, and I might pick up on, I think it's a Roy and a Kathy, and I really appreciate the questions here. So I think both of them are really geared towards, what's the key thing that's going to continue nudging people to be more engaged, aware and conscious of hazards or risks, and how do we get people either at the leadership level or at the frontline level engaged in that conscious brain sort of mode that you talked to?
Great question. And the fact, when you use the word engage, you're actually kicking in the conscious brain or the slow brain. So really building a two-way discussion point, whether that be at whatever mechanism you've got in place within the organisation, from, as I mentioned before, pre-starts or toolbox talks, that it's not a one-way communication, that we really embed that collaborative questioning, that inquiring questioning, and draw on people's experience, because that process of inquiry, you all have highly experienced people in your operations. And what we also know about the brain is if we can actually engage the emotional part of the brain, whether that be through storytelling, that's actually going to create stickability. And what I mean by that is I'm going to be invested in the conversation because it's meaningful for me. It's actually triggering something in my brain that's actually telling me this is important. So if we can weave storytelling, if we can weave engagement into the conversation, if through that inquiry process, through that collaborative questioning, you're less likely for people to be in that fast brain mode.
Fantastic. And look, that probably brings us to a close, Jo. And look, really appreciate your time and obviously the time of the 180 odd people that are on the call right now. There's a number of questions that are unanswered that we would love to follow up in a subsequent email or a follow-up conversation, either by a webinar or otherwise. But if you would like us to follow up on your questions unanswered, of which there are a lot here, please feel free to just post your question online and we'll reach out to you to follow through. Of course, you can always email either Jo or myself or AIHS and request clarity or further conversation around what it is we've discussed today. I know, there's a lot of resources out there in the public domain, and so if you'd like to get access to those or a copy of the presentation itself, please feel free equally to reach out to us. So with that being said, look, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Jo, and look forward to talking to everyone in due course.
Thanks all.